Good day. As with my most recent videos, this video is going to be less about the actual military situation in Ukraine, more about this constant bombard we're now getting of long speeches and information from Russian officials, senior Russian officials, discussing their progress of events in Ukraine itself, in the war, giving us some ideas about their plans, talking about the challenges that they are facing. And in fact, two very important Russian officials have now provided long speeches. The first was the chief of the Russian General Staff, General Valery Gerasimov, in an address which he gave to foreign military attaches, and I will cover that in some detail. And then there was a press conference by no less a person than President Putin himself. Now, as I said, I will come to both of those later because they both tell us quite a lot, both about where we are and about the way things are going. But even though, as I said, this is not going to be primarily a program about the military situation, I think since this is a war, something needs to be said about it. Now, there's been fewer reports over the last 24 hours about what is going on the battlefields. Now, this is not a sign that the fighting is slackening. It could be a sign of the opposite, that the fighting is getting more intense and that more territory is being taken. It's generally the practice, certainly on the Russian side, to withhold information until things become clearer and that we have news about consolidated advances in one place or another. But we have had some news. Firstly, there's been reports from the officials of the Lugansk People's Republic, who are, by the way, far more informative, both the officials of the Lugansk and the officials of the Donetsk People's Republic are far more informative about the progress of the military operation in Ukraine than the official Russian authorities are. Though I would say that they have not always been entirely accurate in some of the things they have said, but generally I feel that they are. Anyway, there's been a report from an official of the Lugansk People's Republic that the Ukrainians are now hastily fortifying some central areas in Bakhmut. They're not just building trenches, they're trying to create fortifications, apparently, in some of the big apartment buildings and other governmental buildings in the center of Bakhmut. And they're also apparently building firing points, or so this official tells us, creating firing points on the roofs of some of these buildings. These are apparently intended to be primarily anti-tank, anti-aircraft systems, anti-drone and anti-helicopter systems, one presumes. So man-pads, heavy machine guns, that sort of thing. And all of that points clearly now to the Ukrainians expecting the Russians to break through very soon into the very center of Bakhmut. But in contrast to what happened in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, the Ukrainians are determined, apparently, to make a fight in central Bakhmut itself. In other words, they're going to try and hold every single location to the extent that they can. Now, at the same time, even as the Russians push deeper into Bakhmut itself, and bear in mind, this is not a particularly big place. Its pre-war population, if we're talking about the metropolitan area of Bakhmut, was around 75,000. So it's not a huge place. So, that tells us how close the various fighting forces are to each other. Anyway, even as the Russians push deeper into Bakhmut, they also seem to be continuing the push to try to cut off these Ukrainian forces from any chance of resupply, with the target now being Ivanivka, apparently another village that controls the strategic roads between Bakhmut and other places on the Ukrainian, further back, Ukrainian areas under Ukrainian control, and that will finally end any prospect both of Ukrainian troops unlucky enough to be earmarked to defend Bakhmut itself from retreating or from getting any kind of resupply from the Ukrainian forces further west. So lots of fighting, lots of things going on in Bakhmut, and this is a difficult battle. But we've also had some information now from none other than Ramzan Kadyrov, who is, of course, the overall head of the Chechen government, but who also takes a very active role in the military conflict. Chechen fighters are a highly visible force on the battlefields. They played an important role earlier in the war, in the fighting in Mariupol, and in the fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And it seems that many of them now are being concentrated in Soledar, which is the northern suburb of Bakhmut, which is the largest suburb town of Bakhmut, to the extent that it can almost be considered a separate town from Bakhmut itself. And Kadyrov says that the Akhmat Special Forces, that's to say the Chechen Special Forces, are systematically mopping up Soledar. Our fighters, led by a courageous commander from Akhmat Special Operations Unit nicknamed Hunter, continue clearing out NATO and Ukrainian soldiers in Soledar. He used a rather stronger label to describe the Ukrainian soldiers, but I have to consider the feelings of the people who run this platform. They have been attacking enemy positions one by one with heavy mortar fire, inflicting substantial losses on the enemy. As a result, they have been liberating quarters from NATO minions one by one, while steadfastly mopping up Soledar from their unwanted presence. Now that gives the impression that the Russian and Chechen forces have broken through and are in the process of taking over Soledar. Now, I have found in the past that Kadyrov tends to predict events rather than report them. In other words, what he says is not necessarily true as at the moment he says it, but it tends to be true in the not very distant future from when he says it. And that suggests that Ukrainian resistance in Soledar may be on the brink of breaking. Well, that's possible. I mean, again, I want to stress, I'm not there. I don't know exactly what's going on, but it does seem as if there is intense fighting in Soledar as well as in Bakhmut itself. And in fact, I may as well say that I've seen lots of reports that the Ukrainian position in Soledar is becoming every bit as precarious as it is in Bakhmut. I'm going to say again, I find Ukrainian defense of Bakhmut tragic, if not perhaps entirely illogical. Brian Beletic has done a very good video describing the strategic importance of Bakhmut. It's also been discussed by Dima at the Military Summary channel, and there was a very, very interesting roundtable with Gonzalo Lira and Brian and Dima and others discussing this precise issue of the importance of Bakhmut on Gonzalo Lira's roundtable. So, you know, one can understand why this pivotal town has to be defended to this degree. There is a kind of military logic to it. But I do wonder, I do ask myself always this question, given the enormously heavy losses that Ukraine is suffering in trying to cling on to Bakhmut, is it really worth it given that almost everybody who follows this battle closely enough accepts that sooner or later Bakhmut, Soledar, all of these places around it will fall. Well, it's the Ukrainians who make these decisions. Zelensky and his commander, General Zaluzhny. Some weeks ago, apparently, General Zaluzhny advised Zelensky that the defense of Bakhmut was unsustainable, but as we saw, Zelensky not only rejected that advice, if it was indeed given, but actually went to Bakhmut himself, or apparently did, to sort of reinforce the importance of holding Bakhmut regardless of the cost. And of course, the fighting in Bakhmut was a centerpiece of his address to Congress the other day, the US Congress the other day. So it seems as if this terrible battle for Bakhmut is going to be fought to the bitter end. Anyway, that's Bakhmut. We've had more information about things from other fronts. We've had comments from the deputy head of the Zaporozhye, the Russian-controlled part of Zaporozhye region, a person called Vladimir Rogov, and he has talked about the enormous strength of the defenses which the Russians have built up in Zaporozhye. It's a three-layered defense. He is deeply skeptical that the Ukrainians have any realistic prospect of breaking through in Zaporozhye, and I suspect he's right. I should say that the Ukrainians have carried out some kind of other bomb attack in Melitopol. This is not a missile strike, it is a bomb attack. The media in Britain are reporting this as a successful attack by Ukraine against Russian spies in the area. I'm not quite sure what that means, but anyway, putting that aside, I come back again to Putin's comments a short time ago to the heads of the internal security agencies. There are clearly still Ukrainian networks operating in these places, and Putin has assigned the internal security agencies the task of clearing them up, which, by the way, I have no doubt that they will eventually will. So we have that situation in Zaporozhye. And further north, in the particularly tense border area of Kharkiv, Lugansk region, it really does now look as if the Ukrainian offensive there has not only petered out, but is in effect being reversed. And we get more reports, though they're not at the moment. The last couple of hours have not been very clear, but there's more reports of more Russian advances, of bitter fighting in all sorts of places that the Russian military have reached as they move towards Kupiansk. And there's also a report today that the Ukrainians are rushing engineering equipment and technicians to Liman, Krasny Liman, or that area, which suggests that they are going to build fortifications because they anticipate some kind of Russian offensive in that area fairly soon. So that's the overall situation on the battlefronts. There are again rumors that over the next couple of days, another massive Russian missile strike on Ukraine will take place. We'll see. Now, there have been a number of fairly interesting reports in the Western media about the military situation, and there was an interesting article in the New York Times, of all places, and its title is, "As Ukraine Prepares for a Second Year at War, the Prospect of a Stalemate Looms. American officials believe that with Russia bolstering defenses and learning lessons, Ukraine will find it more challenging to retake land." And it's a somewhat negative article about the Ukrainian military situation. It won't accept that, in fact, the balance of the war has turned and that it's looking much more likely that it will be the Russians who will be making the big moves next year in 2023. But it does contain some interesting admissions. For example, it does appear to concede that the previous Ukrainian offensives in Kharkiv region and in Kherson region did result in very heavy losses for the Ukrainians. And it acknowledges also the effectiveness of General Surovikin's command of the Ukrainian forces, his success in bringing focus and discipline, as the Daily Telegraph put it some weeks ago, to the Russian forces to build up these elaborate fortifications, to prepare the Russian defenses, to build up those kind of reserves. And this article in the New York Times does rather suggest that any idea of a Ukrainian victory in 2023 is looking increasingly remote. And by the way, this is accompanied by another article, this time in the Wall Street Journal. Europe is rushing arms to Ukraine, but running out of ammunition. And Europe, home to some of the world's largest weapons manufacturers, is struggling to produce enough ammunition for Ukraine and for itself, jeopardizing NATO's defense capacity and its support for Kiev, officials and industry leaders say. And a lack of production capacity, a dearth of specialized workers, supply chain bottlenecks, high costs of financing, and even environmental regulations are putting a brake on an effort to increase output, presenting the West and Ukraine with a fresh challenge for next year. Well, you've heard all of that many times on this channel, on Brian Balletic's channel, from Scott Ritter, from Douglas McGregor, from various people. But it's now becoming increasingly something that even the mainstream media, not the specialized media, not places like RUSI, for example, the Royal United Services Institute and its publications, or the military or defense industry journals in the United States, but the actual mainstream media, the broadsheet newspapers that people read, they're increasingly covering this in the West too. Now, that brings me to the first of the two big speeches or discussions that by senior Russian officials that I'm going to discuss. And the first one I'm going to discuss is that of General Gerasimov, who is the chief of the Russian General Staff. Now, I'm not going to go over everything he said. I'm going to focus on Ukraine, and I'm not going to discuss so much the political aspects of what he said, because to be frank, there isn't anything very new there. And he is, after all, a military man. And I'm going to focus instead on his discussion, both of the conflict, the pattern of the conflict. And I'm going to suggest that there are indications about, he does point to indications of what Russian priorities are. And he begins with the Russian Ministry of Defense account of his words, begin with these words. The special military operation started with long-range, well-planned attacks against airfields, air defense installations, command and control centers, ammunition storage sites, and arsenals. The established groupings of troops launched an onslaught in their assigned areas of responsibility using the findings of the fire attacks. It should be emphasized that the hostilities spread out over a vast area and were fierce from the outset. The Lugansk People's Republic was liberated by active offensive operations of groups of troops. The port city of Mariupol was seized with minimal losses, and full control was established over the Azov Sea coast and the territories of Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. Well, that takes us up to the position as it was midsummer. And then he goes on to say this: despite significant losses in personnel and military equipment, the enemy continued active resistance due to an increase in comprehensive military assistance from the United States and its allies, as well as mobilization activities. Now, we've discussed this many times. Ukraine carried out repeated mobilizations. It built up its army to very big levels by midsummer, and the United States and the Western powers, to a certain extent, though not entirely, replaced the losses Ukraine suffered in the first weeks of the military operation. And then Gerasimov talks about the way in which the Ukrainians used HIMARS missiles to attack all sorts of places. He puts particular emphasis on the attacks on the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station, and again repeats the official Russian line that this was the reason that the Russians evacuated their troops from the right bank, the west bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region. He says that the intention was to destroy the hydroelectric engineering structures of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station, which would result in flooding of the Kherson region and block and destroy a portion of the southern group of forces on the right bank of the Dnieper. And he says that those forces, together with the civilians, were then evacuated. He then says all kinds of things, great length, about the terroristic nature, as he puts it, of some of the things Ukraine does. He talks about Ukraine's shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. But then he goes into the military situation and the supply situation in more detail. He says that in order to prolong the battle, the United States and its allies have been steadily boosting their military support for Kiev. The total amount of foreign funding provided to Ukraine came to approximately $100 billion. Actually, I suspect that's an underestimate. But anyway, that's the figure Gerasimov has given. He says when it comes to supplying armaments, the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland and Romania have provided the most. Since the beginning of the special military operation, the West has delivered to Kiev a total of 4 aircraft. I wonder of what kind. He doesn't say. More than 30 helicopters, that's principally from the United States, but some from Britain too. Over 350 tanks. These appear to have come principally from Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Bulgaria. About 1,000 armoured combat vehicles, at least 800 armoured vehicles, up to 700 artillery systems, 100 multiple rocket launch systems, of which, by the way, he doesn't say it, but 20 are HIMARS, 130,000 anti-tank weapons, more than 5,300 man-pads, that's, surface-to-air missiles to shoot down aircraft that soldiers in battle use, and at least 5,000 drones for various purposes. That's a huge amount of equipment that's been sent to Ukraine, if you take a step and think about it. Now, I don't doubt, by the way, the accuracy of Gerasimov's figures, but you could see the scale of support that has been provided to Ukraine over the last few months. And then he goes on to say, despite the large-scale military and financial assistance provided by the West to the Kiev regime, as well as the deployment of mercenaries to the conflict area, the Russian armed forces will continue the planned special military operation to carry out all the tasks set out by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, who is, of course, Putin. And he then says that with high-precision missiles, more than 1,300 critical facilities in Ukraine have been hit, and that this has significantly reduced the combat capabilities of Ukraine's armed forces. It's disrupted the troop command and control system, paralyzed the work of the military-industrial complex in Ukraine, significantly hampered military transportation. Hypersonic weapons have been employed in battle for the first time. The Kinzhal aviation complex missile system has been shown to be extremely efficient and unaffected by Ukrainian air defense systems. Now, that's an interesting phrase because, so far as I'm aware, there's only been one acknowledged instance of the use of the Kinzhal hypersonic missile, and that was back in March when the Russians used it to attack a Ukrainian training base in the far west of Ukraine at a place called Yaroviv. And it's known that large numbers of, shall we call them Western contractors, were killed in that missile strike, and lots of other Ukrainians were also killed. There's some reports that hundreds of people died as a result of that missile strike. But anyway, that's, as far as I am aware, the only actual use of the Kinzhal missile that the Russians have themselves acknowledged. But the way in which Gerasimov is talking, what he says here, hints that the Kinzhal has been used more than once. If so, I have to admit, I don't know about it. And then he says, with about 150 sorties each day, the operational, tactical, and army aviation are doing their duty under heavy combat intensity. Now, that's a very, very small number of sorties compared to what the Western air forces were carrying out during the Iraq wars, the two Iraq wars. But of course, the Russian Air Force, which is much smaller anyway, has to operate under much more trying air defense conditions. Consider, I mean, quite apart from Ukraine's air defense system, its S-300 systems and all that, the Russians have to contend with 5,300 man-pads. So anyway, more than 11,000 pieces of military hardware belonging to the Ukrainian military have been destroyed, and the implication is by airstrikes. And then he says, drones are frequently utilized in reconnaissance and attack missions. They have been used to annihilate more than 600 targets and reveal about 8,000. And then he talks about mobilization, the fact that the mobilization had to be carried out to stabilize the battlefields, but that this was successful and that this has caused a significant reinforcement of the numbers of troops. And he then says that the Russian armed forces have intensified combat operations, inflicting irreparable damage on the enemy in terms of manpower and equipment. And that's a key sentence, very casually said. And of course, I come back to what the Wall Street Journal has been saying about the lack of ammunition, all the various articles we've now been reading, the things said by Brian Beletic, Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter, myself, us on the Duran, all of those people, about the extent to which the West is now finding it increasingly difficult to keep up with Ukraine's needs in terms of weapon systems and ammunition. And Gerasimov then says that the Russians have now taken under their control 5 times more Ukrainian territory than was previously in the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics. So there we go. Now comes the most important paragraph, in the transcript of Gerasimov's words of all. Currently, the line of contact stretches for 815 kilometers. In view of the measures taken to build up the combat capabilities of the troops, the situation on the front line has stabilized, with the main efforts of the Russian troops concentrating on completing the liberation of the territory of the Donetsk People's Republic. In addition, fire continues to be directed at critical transport and energy infrastructure facilities deep in Ukrainian territory, storage sites for fuel, missiles and ammunition, weapons and military equipment, as well as operational reserves in temporary deployment locations. Note, nothing here about Belarus, nothing here about the Russian forces in the north. And this, it seems to me, gives us a clear insight into Russian intentions. Now, it could, I have to say this in first, it could well be that the Russians, Gerasimov, is engaging here in a sophisticated deception operation. But my strong impression from these words is that, as was suggested by Scott Ritter in the program that he did with Garland Nixon a short time ago, as is also my own view, as I believe is Douglas McGregor's view also, and as is certainly Brian Paletik's view, the focus of the Russian winter offensive, which is indeed coming, will be on Donbass, will be on ending the battle in Donbass, breaking Ukrainian resistance in Donbass, clearing the Ukrainian forces from the Donetsk People's Republic. It does not look to me as if the Russians are planning some great advance on Kiev or on western Ukraine. That is not what these comments of General Gerasimov say. And if I go back to what Scott Ritter was saying on the program with Garland Nixon, Scott Ritter said that the Russians, by focusing on Donetsk, have a winning strategy. It's low risk, but it's highly effective. It's grinding down the Ukrainian army, exactly as General Surovikin said. It's weakening Ukraine's future ability to continue the war, and at the same time, it fulfills Russia's primary mission, the Russian military's primary mission, which right from the start of the special military operation has been the liberation, as the Russians would say, of Donbass. Now, it's not going to end there. Other Russian officials have been talking about the fact that 2023 will see the recapture of Kherson region, west of the Dnieper River, the area that had to be evacuated. There will almost certainly be Russian advances in other places. But the key battle was and remains and has at all times been in Donbass. Once it is won, once Ukrainian resistance there is broken, the Ukrainian army will be fatally weakened. That seems to be the assumption, and I think it's correct. And it will mean that not only will Ukraine have lost its most heavily industrialized region and its most heavily fortified zone, but it will mean that the Russians will have unimpeded access all the way to the east bank of the Dnieper River, opposite places like the important industrial town of Dnipro and other places too. They will in effect be in a position at that point to cut Ukraine in half. So this seems to me logical, and it suggests clearly to me that this is the Russian plan. They're not making much of a secret of it. They are keeping everybody a bit guessing on their toes with all these troops that there are there in Belarus. But I suspect that the primary purpose of those forces in Belarus are firstly to pin Ukrainian soldiers down in the northern borders of Ukraine, protecting Kiev and those sort of places from a possible Russian offensive there, and also to counter this very big Polish build-up, which I discussed in my most recent video. So that's what Gerasimov has been saying. Now, another very important Russian official, as I said, has been speaking, and that is none other than Putin himself. And this, I should say, was in the format of a press conference. Now, this is not the marathon press conference that Putin regularly holds, but it was a meeting with the media, and he did in fact provide some explanation of why there has not been the marathon press conference, and in fact he made it perfectly clear that this is because, frankly, he is very much tied up with other things. So he was asked not about the marathon press conference as such, but about the fact that there has not yet been a meeting of the Federal Assembly. He says the reason for that is that the dynamic of events is very large. The situation is developing very dynamically, so it was not very, but difficult to fix the results and specific plans for the near future at a particular moment in time. We will do this at the beginning of the year, of course. And in other words, it was quite difficult for me and the presidential administration to cram it into a formal message, and that's all. In other words, there just wasn't the time. There was so much else going on, and we've seen how busy Putin has been. By the way, on the same day that the Collegium of the Ministry of Defense had a meeting, and when Putin gave his big keynote address at that speech, on that very same day, he had another meeting of his Security Council. That gives you some idea of how intense Putin's work schedule has been over the last couple of days. Anyway, that is what I wanted to say about this. I don't want to spend more time on this. The press conference was purely postponed because of the very tight scheduling over the last few weeks. Now, Putin talks a great deal about the causes of the Ukrainian conflict, and he again expresses his very bitter feelings about the fact that there's been a war between Russia and Ukraine. He complains about the fact that the Western powers have managed to set the Ukrainian people against the Russians. He says things like this. We proceeded from the fact that, okay, the Soviet Union has ceased to exist, but our common historical roots of culture, spiritual community, they would be stronger than what is pulling us apart, and such there have always been trends. What unites us is stronger. No, with the help of outside forces and with the help of the fact that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, people of extremely nationalist views came to power. With the help of these forces, despite all of our efforts, this disunity has increased and increased. We were pulled apart, divided, and then played off. In this sense, they, he means the West, have achieved results, and in this sense, we have suffered a well-known fiasco. Not the admission that, you know, this has been a tragedy for Russia, in a kind of a way, a defeat for Russia. Instead of Russia and Ukraine becoming friends, the West succeeded in dividing them from each other, leading to the present war. And then he also says that the reconstitution of the Russian world is something that the West won't accept. And he says that on the one hand, they insist that other nations, other peoples should be allowed to come together, but Russians should not be allowed to do so. And he talks, again with great bitterness, about the suppression of Russian culture and the Russian language, and the efforts made to divide our spiritual community. That means the Orthodox Church, which previously united both Ukraine and Russia, and the attempts to divide that, and in completely barbaric ways. And he also refers, by the way, to the fact that it was probably a mistake by Joseph Stalin to incorporate Western Ukraine, Galicia, into Ukraine. Its militant anti-Russian nationalism has supposedly infected the rest of Ukraine and has been one of the key causes of the present crisis. Look through the pages of history. One of the deputies of the still Tsarist State Duma said, if you want to lose Ukraine, attach Galicia, that's to say Western Ukraine, to it. In the end, it happened. He turned out to be a visionary. Why? Because people from this part of Ukraine behave very aggressively and in fact suppress the silent majority in the rest of the country. And then he talks about, as I said, the bitterness that he feels about the way in which nobody seems to acknowledge Russian aspirations for people to come together. He says nobody wants the unification of the Russian people. Disunion, that is their pleasure. They will shred it further, but no one wants us to unite and strengthen except us. And we will do it, and we will do it. So the West doesn't want it, but it will happen anyway, regardless of whether or not the West wants it to happen. And then he talks, because he was asked about the Patriot system, and he says quite a lot about it. He says that as for the Patriot, it is quite an old system. It does not work like, say, our S-300. Nevertheless, those who oppose us proceed from the fact that this is supposedly a defensive system. Okay, we'll just keep it in mind, and there will always be an antidote. So those who do this are doing it in vain. It's just prolonging the conflict, that's all. And as you will see, he has an awful lot more to say about the Patriot system further on. But then he's asked an interesting question about the depletion of weapon stocks in the West and the alleged depletion of weapon stocks in Russia, that the Russians supposedly are also running out of weapons. And by the way, the US Ministry of Defense, the Department of Defense, is now claiming that the Wagner organization is now buying shells for North Korea, both for itself and presumably from the Russian armed forces, something which both Russia and North Korea have vigorously denied. Anyway, this is what Putin says about Western resources. He said, I think that the resources of the Western countries are not on the verge of exhaustion. After all, the point is different. The point is Ukraine receives weapons from the former Warsaw Pact countries, mainly of Soviet production. This is really close to exhaustion. We practically knocked everything out burnt it out. There you can count several dozen units of armoured vehicles, 100, sometimes else on this scale. They beat a lot, it's true, this technique is close to exhaustion. But then he goes on to say that the West itself is not yet without weapons, but he does say that there are problems with the Western production of systems. There are questions related to the capabilities of the military-industrial complex of Western countries. Yet it is big. Yes, it is big in the United States. It can be promoted, but even there, it is not so easy because you need to allocate additional money to this account, and this is a matter of allocating resources within the framework of the budget process. It's not that easy. And then he comes back to Patriot and says, Patriot can be put there. Well, let them put it. We will click on the Patriot. I don't quite know what that means. Then it will, but anyway, then it will be necessary to put something instead of Patriot. It is necessary to develop new systems. In other words, they'll knock out the Patriot, and the Russians will knock out the Patriot. The United States will be left thrashing around trying to find some alternative to it. This is a complex, lengthy process. Everything is not so simple. We take this into account. We also consider everything that appears there. We consider where and how much is still in warehouses and what is left, what they can produce, in what time frame, how they can produce. And then he says quite a lot about Russian military abilities. In contrast to the Ukrainian industry, we have been developing our own industry over the past decades. We have developed our military science and technology. We are still missing some things, loitering ammunition, drones, and so on, but we have the groundwork. We have our own financial resources to ensure the work of scientific and technological centers and the production itself. We have it. There is a question related to increasing the pace and volume. We are able to do it, and we will definitely do it. So they will not run out of weapons. And then he's skeptical about the prospects of a negotiated settlement. He says that for the moment, there's no sign of it, but perhaps eventually it will happen. And then he talks about the fact that the Russian economy is in good shape, surprisingly good shape, as it comes to the end of the year. The GDP contraction will only be 2.5%. It will not be as big, 20% or whatever it was that people predicted. And he talks at length about how Russia is going to run only a small deficit this year of 2% of GDP, which it can easily fund, and that it will continue with its programs, its economic and social programs and long-range plans. And in some ways, the sanctions have made that easier to do. And then he talks about the oil price cap. And this is perhaps one of the most interesting parts of his discussion, because he says that on Monday or Tuesday of next week, he's going to sign some kind of a decree responding to the oil price cap. He says that the goal is clear to our geopolitical opponents to limit the revenues of the Russian budget, but we do not lose anything from this ceiling. There are no losses for the Russian fuel and energy complex and for the budget. There are no losses because we sell at these prices. But this is not the point at all. The point is that they're trying to screw new instruments, absolutely not inherent in a market economy, into the world energy sector, into the world economy. The consumer buyer is trying to introduce into the consciousness and practice of the whole world completely new tools, not inherent in a market economy, non-market regulation. And then he points out that the energy industry is already underinvested. And so there are problems related to the fact that in recent years, due to environmental issues and the transition to renewable energy sources, money has not been invested in new projects, in pipelines, in production, in development. For example, banks do not give money. Insurance companies do not insure. The world's major companies have stopped investing in the volume that is needed for global energy. And now they're also trying to establish a price ceiling administratively. This is the road towards the destruction of world energy. There may come a time when the underinvested industry stops producing the required volume of products on the market, and then prices will skyrocket and hurt those who are trying to implement these tools. Therefore, producers of energy resources, in this case oil, take everything at their own expense, not at Russia's expense, but at their own expense, because everyone believes that this is only the first attempt to impose administrative rules on price regulation. And then he discusses the gas ceiling. This is from the same opera, in other words, as the oil price. An attempt to administratively regulate prices will not lead to anything good in the gas sector as well as in the oil sector. You know, sometimes our colleagues and partners, he's being ironic now, surprise me with their unprofessional decisions. At one time, it was the European Commission that imposed on us the transition to the so-called market pricing, the exchange pricing for gas. In other words, spot prices on the spot market in place of long-range contracts. And we persuaded them, I personally did it, persuaded them in Brussels not to do this. They said that this is not how the gas market works. This will lead to serious consequences to a surge in prices. And in fact, he was unsuccessful. He wasn't able to talk the European Commission, into sticking with long-term contracts. They insisted on spot prices, linking the gas price to spot prices on the spot market, and justified this as market pricing. And he warned them that this would lead to a surge in prices, and he goes on to say this is exactly what happened right now. Now they do not know how to get out of here, and they are trying to regulate gas prices as well. So by going on to market prices, insisting on what they called market prices, in other words, instead of long-term price contracts with Gazprom, insisting on buying gas on the spot market at whatever price the market was deciding from one day to the next, and at the same time, of course, imposing all these sanctions on Gazprom. What we see instead are energy shortages and an explosion in prices, and the Commission, which had been talking about the importance of market pricing, is now it's gone full circle, and it's trying to regulate prices, gas prices. It's trying to cap them instead. And he says it's true that this is a slightly different regulation than the attempt to regulate oil prices. The European Commission is talking more about the need to regulate the situation on the stock exchange. A link is made to liquefied natural gas. It is said that prices should be correlated with liquefied natural gas prices and so on. But still, this is an attempt to regulate prices administratively. You know, they don't listen to us, they don't want to, they don't like us, they fight with us. But they should have heard themselves. In this case, I'm talking about those who are trying to regulate gas prices in Europe. Instead, they obey the Americans in everything, constantly bowing and bending every time they're given a command. This is not a team. They should just listen to what American experts say. Milton Friedman, a well-known economist, Nobel Prize winner, said a wonderful thing. If you want to create a shortage of tomatoes, impose a price limit on tomatoes. Tomorrow you will have a shortage of tomatoes. There you go. And then he discusses Nord Stream and the way there's been those attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines. He says this was a terrorist attack. It's obvious, everybody recognized it. And then he says this is an act of international, I would say, state terrorism, because individuals, private individuals, natural persons alone, without the support of state structures, are not able to carry out such attacks. It is clear that this was done with the support of states. And he says, as they usually say in such cases, look who is interested. Who is interested in the line of Russian gas supply to the European market, passing only through Ukraine? Who is interested in Ukraine receiving money? The aggressor supposedly is Russia, but they receive money from us for transit. We pay them, despite the fact that they call us aggressors, although they themselves are the aggressors in relation to Donbass. So he's fairly broadly hinting here that the party, at least one of the parties behind the attacks on Nord Stream, is Ukraine. And he makes it fairly clear that these attempts to impose caps on the prices of Russian oil and Russian gas, that they will eventually be extended to the oil and gas supplied by other energy producers in the Gulf and elsewhere. So, quite an interesting rundown from Putin. Very bitter words about Ukraine. Deep anger at the way in which the West has acted. In fact, deep outrage. It's clear that he now sees the West as implacably hostile to Russia, seeking to divide Russia from Ukraine. He knows, he talks actually in this press conference, elsewhere in the press conference, he talked about how attempts to sow anti-Russian feeling in Ukraine actually began during the Soviet era. And he says how various institutions in Ukraine, and I no doubt here that he means academic institutions, first and foremost, were heavily infiltrated from the West, which then planted through these institutions Ukrainian nationalism in its most virulent form in Ukraine. And he's not bothered by the Patriot system at all. He thinks that, you know, the Russians will be able to knock it out without too much difficulty. He doesn't fear that Russia is going to run out of weapons. They've got a military-industrial complex prepared and ready to crank out more weapons. And as for the West, well, they still have lots of weapons. If they have problems keeping Ukraine supplied, basically that's their problem. He is not going to comment on that further. And he discusses the oil price and the gas price caps. And here I want to make an admission. In one of my recent videos, I think in fact in my last one, or perhaps my penultimate one, I accepted as true an article in Bloomberg that claimed that Russian oil exports over the course of December have fallen by 54%. In other words, that they more than halved. Bloomberg, after all, does have a reputation for accurate reporting of economic news. Well, I should have known better, And it's been pointed out to me in a private email from a most authoritative source, and that source has provided, by the way, data, or referred me to data which establishes what she says, and that Bloomberg story is simply and completely wrong. I'm not sure what, if any, decline in Russian oil exports there has actually been over the course of December, but it is certainly nothing like 54% or anything remotely approximating to that. It appears that there have been some bottlenecks in some Russian ports, but overall, Russian oil exports are continuing at a much stronger level than Bloomberg is leading us to think. So I want to say that it's my mistake. I should know by now that any article about this sort of thing, anything relating to Russia in the Western media, has to be checked and corroborated fully. And in this case, I have to admit that I didn't do so. I didn't do my homework properly. But anyway, this is an error. There's not been a collapse in Russian oil exports this month. That Bloomberg story was wrong, either because of incorrect reporting on the part of Bloomberg, or for some other reason, which I'm not going to try to speculate about. So, in summary, where are we? Fighting continues in Donbass. We're getting reports now that the Ukrainians are preparing to make a last stand in Bakhmut. It looks like that's the direction of travel in that battle. I'm not sure that this is correct or wise, and the humanitarian effect of this is going to be tragic, but there it is. It seems also that the situation in Soledar is also looking very grim for Ukraine as well. And we now have admissions from the New York Times that the Ukrainians will struggle to succeed in any future offensives that they try, and an admission in the Wall Street Journal that Europe is now running out of ammunition and can't keep up with Ukraine's demands, as, by the way, the United States is. And we have what I take to be a very strong hint from General Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, that all major offensive operations by Russia over the next few weeks and months will be in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, possibly in Kharkiv region, but the focus will be on breaking Ukrainian resistance in Donbass, pushing the Ukrainians out of Donbass, and then perhaps pushing them further west still over the Dnieper, over to the west bank of the Dnieper in places like Dnipro or whatever. That is the primary objective of the Russian military at the present time. Later, of course, other things might happen, but that is their present objective. It doesn't seem to me that an offensive towards Kiev or western Ukraine is being planned, or at least it's not being, if it is being planned, then the Russians are keeping it very secret. And Putin, for his part, discounts any suggestion that the Russians are going to run out of weapons. He says that they're producing all the weapons that they need, and they will produce even more. He does accept that the Ukrainians might be having problems because they've run through all of their stock of weapons. He says the Western powers, they've still got lots of weapons. Whether they want to share with Ukraine is their own problem. And as for their production problems, well, that's a matter for them. He's not really going to comment about it very much. But he is very, very bitter and blames the West again for the cause, the creation of this war. And at the same time, he ridicules both the oil price cap and the gas price cap. He points out that this contradicts Western practice and Western economic philosophy, market-based economic philosophy, which teaches that the idea to impose price caps, in other words, to control prices administratively, leads to no good outcomes, and he predicts that these attempts to impose caps on energy prices are almost certainly going to expand to try to affect other producers as well. That will limit investment in fossil fuels even further, leading to a major energy crisis in a few years' time. So, quite powerful and in some ways very informative words from Gerasimov and Putin. And just to repeat again, my last admission, no, there has not been a collapse in Russian oil exports. I said that there had been on the basis of a Bloomberg article. It seems I was wrong. So that's me for today. Lots, as I say, coming up from Russia at the moment. We'll see whether Putin keeps up this whirlwind pace of activity. It's becoming a struggle keeping up with him. It looks like, by the way, he's going to have a very busy January and February with a Federal Assembly meeting coming, probably a marathon press conference as well on the way. And we'll also obviously have to keep an eye out on what goes on in the military situation. So that's me for today. Again, over an hour, but I hope this has been interesting and useful. And in the meantime, please remember, you can find all our videos on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And last but not least, if you want to, you should check out our shop and find the great things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweets, our sweatshirts and our t-shirts. And you can also press the like button on this video if you've liked this video, and check your subscription to this channel. And it only remains for me to thank you for joining me again today, and to look forward to you joining me again soon.